Well, I'd like to thank everybody who is here today, and we're going to talk about UDL representation. So we're going to talk about how we can include representation in our classrooms. So we hit the X there. Right. Yep. There we go. So does anybody know what UDL stands for?
I looked it up this morning, but I forgot.
So it's a universal design for learning.
Yes.
So how do we design our courses to make sure that the most people possible can learn from them? So why do we need representation? Well, learning can't be properly achieved if students don't have a connection to the content. Otherwise, they just regurgitate the knowledge and they don't actually retain it. So if it requires extraordinary effort, then they're not going to be able to learn. So being able to eliminate as many barriers as possible for our students is going to give them the best chance at success. Oh, can you click on the thing?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
That's okay. Okay, it also ensures information is accessible to all learners. So if you showed up for the ADA Disability Services, you will remember me saying, would you rather make a chocolate peanut butter cake and then have to remake it all over again because somebody is allergic to peanuts? Or would you rather make a really yummy vegan cake with no nuts or anything in it so that everybody can enjoy it and not have to remake it the second time? So we want to make sure that when we create our courses that we have options for language and symbols. Not everybody speaks English, so making sure that whatever we're saying is concise enough to be translated if they need to use Google Translate. Options for comprehension. Not everybody learns in the same way, so we want to make sure that if individuals need a visual reminder or they need more auditory clues, that we can give those to them. We want to make sure that we have equity in the curriculum. So we want to make sure that it's equal access for all. Colleges were not set up for the types of people that are now enrolling in colleges. They were created for, 18 to 21-year-old white males from relatively affluent circumstances. That's not who we are anymore. And so we need to make sure that we have this equity in our curriculum. Decolonization. So we need to make sure that we're presenting multiple views of the information so that it's not colonized. The colonized information, it can be as simple as there's a there's a publisher book that says the African slave trade routes brought workers to America. Well, by saying workers, we're implying that they weren't forced to come here and work for nothing. So that's the colonization language. So making sure that we check our biases. And then also making sure that we represent those who may have invisible disabilities. So making sure that we make it accessible for those who have dyslexia. Lots of adult learners don't like to disclose disabilities. And so making sure that we give them accommodations built into our curriculum so that even if they don't ask for it, it's there for them. So Vark is an acronym for different ways of accessing information. So it's visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic. Now on the next page, you're going to get to take the Var Questionnaire so that you can find out how you learn best. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't learn from the other ways. It just means that if we can help supplement a lot of reading and writing with other ways, that gives more representation in our curriculum. So there's the Var Questionnaire. It should have showed up on your device. And you just go through and answer those questions. And then I'm going to ask you guys about your results. So it'll only take about 2 or 3 minutes. Be honest, there is no wrong answer. And if you're on the chat or on the Zoom and you finish, if you'll just put up the raised hand so that I know that you're finished. Give you about 1 more minute. It's an I. Yes, yes, Nearpod uses sans serif font so that it can be easily read. That's the only reason I knew it was an I and not a number 1. Okay, so let's talk about your results. Does anybody want to share what their results were?
Okay, so mine has visual 5, oral 10, read write 8, and kinesthetic 7.
So it sounds like you're more of an auditory learner.
Apparently.
Apparently. What about you, Miss Rebecca?
Mine is very strong kinesthetic.
Kinesthetic, so that's hands-on, that's doing things, that's simulations, that is, it doesn't have to be something that they physically like do in a laboratory, although that helps. It can be anything that actually simulates doing it. I myself am a kinesthetic learner, and so allowing a allowing me to be able to do something as opposed to just telling me really works. So you can use the Vark survey with your students to get a better understanding of how your students kind of learn. But making sure that you're including all four into your curriculum allows for representation in that curriculum.
There's something wrong there.
What?
Yep.
Oh.
Never mind, fix it.
So when we talk about UDL, and this is taken from the UDL website, and we talk about providing multiple means of representation, we want to make sure that we provide options for perception, so different ways of seeing things. We want to provide options for language and symbols, so different ways of hearing things. I find that if your students are having trouble being able to understand a concept, having their peers explain it to them with a different context can be helpful. I am not up on all the slang or the tea, as the kids say. So they may have a different perspective to give their individuals an analogy. And then providing options for comprehension. So we've mentioned this before, but making sure that unless reading and writing is part of a huge part of your objectives, allowing your students to provide you with evidence that they have comprehended what you've said in different ways, like Flipgrid, Nearpods, allowing them to do comics or some different things. And we're going to see some of those practical applications as we go through. So we talked about the why. So when we're talking about UDL, we're talking about students being able to see the information and being able to access that information. So this is an example slide. So what I'm going to do on the next slide is you guys are going to be able to go through and tell me what you think is wrong with this slide, okay? So you can circle, one of the most glaring problems and then type out why it is a problem next to it. Will you toggle the teacher mode?
Very helpful.
Never. There we go.
I'm gonna clear some of this away.
Yes, please. So this is an example of how you can ensure that your students can show you their comprehension. This doesn't require a lot of writing, but we can definitely see that students understand what we're talking about in terms of representation. Oh no. Oh, you gotta close the instructions.
So what else do you think is wrong? Just too bad.
Yeah. We could bring up the example.
Which one? Just hit student?
You can hit student, yeah. So a lot of you picked these images as incorrect. Why did you pick those images?
I don't know what's happening.
You don't know what's happening.
I can't read it.
Okay. So I was like, what? So
Tawny Tibbetts also said, too small.
yes, they're too small. They are difficult to read. The other thing is that they don't have any alternative text. So if your student was visually impaired and needed a description of what that picture was, there's not one provided. So the arrows, they just clutter up the slide, right?
I don't know what's happening with it.
Exactly. So they're unnecessary. So making sure that we remove unnecessary elements. I don't know if you can read it, but there's a little tiny piece of font down here that says, "Can you read me?" And you can't because the contrast isn't high enough. The other thing, this background is gorgeous, but it can be very visually distracting for your students. The other thing that nobody got though was that we have light text on a dark background. It is better to do dark text on a light background for the contrast. It helps people with dyslexia, also helps people who have visual impairments. So I would love to use some slides that have light on dark, but I choose not to usually because it makes it harder for the students to read. Questions? Okay. Can you hit the
Yes.
next button or? There we go. So now we've talked about the why, let's talk about the how. So how do we provide that representation? Well, we need to customize the display of that information. Flexible format. So make sure that the size of your text and images and graphs, all of those kinds of things are easily able to be seen. Make sure that the contrast between the background and the text are clear. Making sure that if you're going to use a color for information or for emphasis, then make sure that that color is easily distinguishable from other colors and also high contrast. So you wouldn't want to use like yellow on a white background. The volume or rate of your speech or sound, I tend to go really fast. And so I have to remind myself to slow down because not everybody processes language at the same speed. The speed or timing of videos, animation, or sound simulations. If you have an autistic student in your class that has noise aversion, then using a lot of loud sounds can be difficult for them. Also using things that flash. If you have a student who has seizures in your class, maybe they didn't disclose that to you, but they do, and you turn on a GIF that's like, then all of a sudden, that's a technical term, by the way, then all of a sudden, you've got a kid seizing on the floor. And then using the dyslexia font for your print materials is a great way to customize the display of information. Alternatives for auditory. So we know that some people can't hear, but also some people aren't auditory learners. So making sure that we use a text equivalent. So captioning our videos, providing notes for students who have an auditory issue, providing visual diagrams, charts. So I can tell you that 75% of our students here at Chatham State are traditional students. It would be more effective if I showed you a chart if you're not an auditory learner. So I can say it and that helps my auditory learners, but also having that visual to back it up helps my visual learners as well. You could provide American Sign Language for spoken English. They can access interpreter through Dina's office. So using visual analogs to represent emphasis, so providing emoticons, symbols, images, and then equivalents for sound effects or alerts, so some sort of vibration that they can feel, those kinds of things.
I'm just putting the information about Dina.
Yes, thank you. Questions about alternatives for auditory information? Okay, can you hit the? Thanks. And then alternatives for visual information. So we know that we have students who have blindness, but we also have students who can't afford a pair of glasses. They have dyslexia, but they've never been diagnosed. They have dysgraphia, but they've never been diagnosed. So providing alternatives for visual information is important for them as well. So like I said, that alternative text, so that when they're using screen readers, they can, and when you're providing that alternative text, making sure that it's very detailed, because if I were to describe what Sarah's wearing today, if I'm going to provide it in enough detail that the person who is getting that information can visualize it, I can't just say she's wearing a black sweater, okay? She's wearing a black 3/4 length shrug that's made out of cotton. That would be a better description. Does that make sense? Sweet. So following our accessibility standards, providing physical objects, if that's an option. When I would teach atoms, it's a very abstract concept. So we would make atoms out of Play-Doh. And so that helped my students who weren't visual learners in terms of helping them with their tactile senses. I didn't have any blind students, but I had a lot of students who had trouble visualizing things. I have trouble visualizing. My husband says that when he reads a book, he sees it as a movie in his head, and I don't see that. I just read the words and know what's going on. So helping them visualize things. So what does this actually look like in your classroom? Okay, how are we providing these alternative methods of representation? One great way to make sure that you are providing representation for your students who are having trouble seeing is when you're doing an example problem on the board, describing exactly what you're doing. So if you're doing math, saying, I wrote out the problem and saying the problem, and then saying, here I took 4 from the right side of the equal sign and moved it over to the left side, so that they can understand what it is that you're trying to tell them, or what you're trying to get them to see. If you're just dissecting something, like if you're in the sciences, making sure you describe what it should feel like, because when you get it, it's a bunch of brown mush. So knowing that the kidneys and the liver are hard, but that the lungs are kind of squishy and the intestines are squishy, letting them know about those tactile things that they should be able to identify as well. Another way to provide alternative methods of comprehension is something called EdPuzzle. So you can turn your lecture into a video and then into a quiz. So if you record yourself while you're lecturing, or if you record a video afterwards, you can take it and put it into EdPuzzle and add open-ended questions, multiple choice questions. You can add notes. You can add, like if you find an already created video, which that's the way to go. From Crash Course, they have a lot of really good videos, or TED Talks, You can put in your own audio over that video so that you can tell them what exactly you want them to have. The nice thing is that they can't skip forward. It automatically captions it, and it allows you to make sure that they're comprehending the information as they go. They can rewatch it as many times as they want, because again, some students don't process it the first time. They have to hear it 2 or 3 times, or they have to see it 2 or 3 times. So allowing them to have that representation in your, also making sure that you provide closed captioning for your students. Nate sent out a Tuesday teaching tip last week about how you can turn on Microsoft Word and then turn on the video, and you hit dictate, and while this video is running, it's writing down all of the things that you're saying.
It only works in the web version.
Yes, it only works in the web version.
There's a problem that stops the actual app version from working because it mutes the video whenever, so. Excellent.
Yes, but it does take out the tedium of having to type out everything that you're
I
saying.
think much faster, especially if you're trying to type out your own thing as it plays, you're going to have to stop and go back. And,
Right.
you know, it'll much, and you can leave the room while it does it. But
Yes, so you can do that. Also, preparing yourself a script before you record a video, before you give a lecture, so that you can just use that as your template, and just add in the little extra bits and pieces of things that we say while we're giving a lecture. Providing your lecture slides, sometimes professors don't like to do this, but it allows the students to revisit that information, which is how they're going to retain it. And then using the dyslexia font, again, helps those students with visual issues. Representation in teaching, making sure that you're evaluating your textbook for representation. Are there BIPOC individuals, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and how are they portrayed? So there might be 15 pictures of Native Americans in your book, but if everything is about how they are, you know, that they weren't as sophisticated and, you know, those kinds of things, then you're not really representing that culture well. Are there other resources that you can provide to show those people of color in another way? We have a thing about content curation that's coming out on Tuesday about how to find those resources, and something called The Danger of a Single Story. So it's a TED Talk, and if you haven't watched it, it's one of the best TED Talks of all times. But when we only get our information from one source, how can we trust that that is the whole story? I used to ask my AVID students about the Alamo, and I'd say, well, what happened in the Alamo? And so they'd tell me, you know, oh, well, the Texans, you know, they tried to hold off Santa Anna, and, you know, they died heroes. And I said, okay, now think about it if you were a Mexican citizen learning about the Alamo. How would that look differently to you? And so providing that representation is very important. Multiple ways to show mastery. Do an audio recording. Do a comic strip. Do a one-pager. This is a one-pager right here that one of my students actually did. And so they had to tell me about codominance versus sex-linked traits. Now, I could assess that by saying, write me out a paragraph about colorblindness. But this way, your creative students get a creative outlet. Your students who aren't as great at writing have a way to visually tell you that they understand what you're trying to get them to say. You do need to make sure that when you do a one-pager that you give them like rules about how to do it. So I always said that they had to have a picture, that there had to be a title, that they had to include 3 facts. They had to include an interesting piece of trivia, and that when I looked at it, I would know this is what it was about. And just making sure that it was neat also. You can do one-pagers physically. So not everything has to be a technology thing. You can have them just take out a piece of paper, separate it into 5 squares. You can have them do it technologically where they make a slide. Same thing. Google Tours are great for those people who are in different fields. Like, let's say that you are talking about residential schools, and you can have them build a tour of where residential schools started and what residential schools are still around now, and which residential schools they've found, you know, the most people, the most bodies at, those kinds of things. If you're doing geoscience, there for Miss Tawny, you can have them build a tour that shows where certain rocks or certain rock formations come from. A course map is another great way for them to consolidate that information, but not have to write it out in paragraph essay form. So creating what your main topic is, and then your little subtopics, and having them be able to put what the most important parts are under those subtopics, and then having them create a wiki. That's a fun way for them to be able to consolidate all of that information as well. Questions about these ways of showing mastery? Any of them appeal to you?
I've used the one pager this semester.
Did they like it?
They seem to.
Good. And did they show their mastery through that?
Yes, yes, and we did mastery and I think a lot of creativity.
Yes, because nobody wants to do boring things. And so if we can spark that creativity, it's shown that we can help increase that retention and that achievement. So now that we've talked about the what and the how, let's talk about the why. There's empirical evidence that UDL increases achievement. So there was a study by CAP, which is in my resources that you can look at. It's an effective teaching methodology for improving the learning process for all students. So when you do these things, it's not just going to help your students who need that representation, it's going to help all of your students. And again, if you plan for all eventualities, then you don't have to make it up when you do get that student who comes in and says, I have these accommodations, and you go, ha, I got you. We already planned it out. So those are some ways that we can make sure that we are helping those students, even if they don't disclose, and not having to do more work later. Questions, comments, concerns?
So when you talked about I apologize, I'm gonna go back just a little bit.
Yeah,
When
absolutely.
you talked about like the EdPuzzle,
Uh-huh.
are you saying like you do the video, record the lecture, and then you have them view the video like in class?
No, you can do it, they do it in EdPuzzle.
Okay.
Now you can do it where you project the EdPuzzle and they can all answer in time. But the best way that I found that worked is if we were in a flipped classroom, yes, they were responsible for reading the chapter, but if I could find an EdPuzzle that went with those main focus points, then that was providing another way for them to have representation and for them to be able to get the information, because I could spend hours making a really cool video, or I can go to EdPuzzle and they have Khan Academy, they have TED Talk, they have YouTube, they have Crash Course, all of these things that are already made for you. So all you have to do is take that video and just add questions. Sometimes they already have question banks built. Do you mind going in the to edpuzzle.com? Okay. Let me log in. So you can see here that you can search for anything. So what's an example of something that you teach that you might need help with?
Research.
Okay, so research methodologies. And if you look, there are all these videos about research methodologies. If it has the little duck right there, that means that they've already created questions for that video, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And you can copy those and edit the questions if you want, but they have a plethora of videos to help you out with that. Does that help?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And it's free. Free. Any other questions? So, if you don't mind filling out the form for some feedback, would be greatly appreciated so we can help give you guys the kinds of things that you want. And the resources will be in the PDF that we throw up on our TLPC website after I edit this video. Thanks everybody for coming.